They told him not to stay there. Not because of what was, but because of what never left. The judge's house stood alone, wrapped in ivy and silence, too still for comfort. It hadn't aged. It had waited. Inside, time didn't move. It watched. The air was thick, not with dust, but with judgment. The kind that lingers even after the sentence is passed. Malcolm called it solitude. The house called it something else. And as the candle flickered that first night, something upstairs shifted, without footsteps. The house did not greet him. It waited. The judge's house stood on the edge of town. A house once feared, now forgotten, saved for whispers. It had no neighbors, no flowers, and no children dared toss stones near its rusted gate. Ivy crept like veins across its brick walls. The windows remained shut, even in spring. And yet, it had not collapsed. It had not crumbled. It had endured. Malcolm Malcolmson, lean, composed, and sharp-eyed, was a mathematics scholar, book-bound, logic-driven, and, by all appearances, immune to superstition. He had left the noise of the university and the crowded boarding houses behind for a few weeks of uninterrupted study for his final examination. He was studying for mathematical honors, and the distractions of the city, noise, chatter, and the temptation of social invitations, had grown intolerable. He wasn't looking for comfort, only for silence. The town had no name that mattered. It was just far enough from the city to feel forgotten, but close enough to return quickly if he wished. He walked with purpose through the muddy lanes, arriving at Mrs. Witham's lodging house. She answered the door herself, a woman with tightly pinned gray hair and a look of someone who had seen more than she wished to. "Yes. I was told you might have a room for let. Just for a few weeks." She blinked slowly at him, looked over his shoulder as though checking for someone else, then opened the door. "Come in then." Her home was warm, cluttered, and smelled faintly of dried lavender. He took the room at the top of the stairs. It was small, cramped, and let in a square of pale light. But he didn't mind. He unpacked his books with reverence and started studying. Mrs. Witham then called him for dinner. Downstairs, over a modest dinner. He explained that he was looking for something quieter. Mrs. Witham raised an eyebrow. "Quieter than this?" He smiled and said, utterly silent. "I need to shut the world out." She considered him carefully, chewing slowly. "There's one place," she said at last. "Though no one's asked after it in years." His interest rose. She went on, carefully. "It's at the edge of town. Large house. Empty since, well, it was once the home of a judge. Strict man. Lived alone. Died alone. Nobody's taken it since. Because it's old." She hesitated. "Because it's not, right." He tilted his head. "Things happen in houses, Mr. Malcolmson. Sometimes they echo and sometimes they speak." He almost laughed. "I'm a rational man, Mrs. Witham. Mathematics doesn't allow for echoes of the dead." She didn't respond. Just poured more tea. The next morning, he inquired further at the local grocer. The man behind the counter, Mr. Crank, was a lean, sun-weathered man who stopped slicing cheese when Malcolm mentioned the house. "The judge's house?" Crank repeated, as if saying the name aloud was enough to draw eyes from the shadows. "Yes, is there someone who holds the keys? An agent perhaps?" Crank rubbed his jaw, then nodded toward the back corner of the shop. "Mr. Denton. Retired solicitor. He handles old properties, or what's left of them." Denton's office was above the shop, a small dusty room with yellowed papers and a smell of dry ink. The man himself was stooped, white-haired, and not especially friendly. But he listened to Malcolm's request, sighed deeply, and finally opened a drawer. "Still want it?" he asked, holding out the key. "You must have heard a lot about the house by now. Are you sure about your decision?" "It's just a house," Malcolm replied with a smile. The old man looked at him for a long moment. "No. It's not just a house. It's a judge's house." Malcolm said nothing. He took the key and left. The house was larger than he expected. 2 stories. Stonework stained with age. A rusted iron gate that screamed when touched. Windows that looked in but didn't let anything out. The front door was heavy. The kind that makes you lean in with your whole weight. When it finally gave way, the smell of old wood and closed air swept over him. Inside were dark mahogany floors, an entry hall that stretched like a throat, rooms sprawling on either side. Curtains yellowed with age. Dust so fine it floated like fog. He set down his suitcase in the drawing room. This would be his sanctuary. He opened the tall windows, let in what little light the sky would allow. The fireplace still had the bones of a previous fire, long dead. On the far wall, a single portrait. A man in crimson and black robes. Thin, with iron-gray hair. His eyes, set deep, and cold. His mouth was pursed, stern, the kind of mouth that didn't speak much, but always meant judgment. Malcolm stared for a moment. Then, shaking his head, turned his back and began to clean. That first day passed in quiet labor. He swept, dusted, opened windows, and made a rough bed on the faded couch. By evening, the house felt less haunted and more hollow. He lit a candle, brewed tea, and began to study by the firelight. It was everything he wanted, quiet, uninterrupted, still. Only, the stillness was too complete. There were no settling noises. No sighs in the pipes. No creaks of old beams. Just a silence that felt awake. The second day began with rain. Malcolm rose early, took tea he had brought with him, and immersed himself in his studies. His candle burned low as dusk arrived once again. But something had changed in the room. The portrait. He had turned his back to it while reading. Now it seemed closer. Just slightly. He stood, approached the painting. Of course it hadn't moved. It was just the shadows playing tricks. He reached out, touched the canvas. The frame was dusty, yet faintly warm. He turned away. Behind him, silence. Not empty silence. Listening silence. That night, the scratching began. Not loud. Not aggressive. But deliberate. It came from above. From the ceiling. Then from the walls. Then, from inside the wall. He rose with his candle and checked for rats. He found none. He even left cheese in a small dish. The next morning, the cheese was untouched, yet the scratching returned again the next night. He wrote it off, the house was old. Settling sounds. Maybe rats that didn't like cheese. Yet each night, the sound grew a little bolder. By the 4th night, the candle near his book went out, suddenly. No wind. No draft. The flame didn't fade, it snapped. He relit it, staring at the wick. And in that moment, he saw the portrait again. The eyes. They were not just watching. They were waiting. He took the portrait down the next day. He had had enough of it, its presence, its shadow. He placed it face down against the far wall. But that night, as he returned from brushing his coat near the door, it was back. Hung perfectly. No sign of it having been moved. He laughed, a dry, uncertain laugh, and took it down again. This time, he locked it in the closet. He did not sleep well. By the end of the first week, Malcolm's notebooks were filled with equations, but his eyes were sunken, and his fingers twitched without reason. The scratching had become footsteps. Not overhead, but in the hallway. He would open the door. Nothing. Just cold. And the candle flames flickered when the steps came near. He asked the town grocer if anyone else had lived in the house recently. The man shook his head. Not in 15 years. Not since, well, no one stays long. They all leave by the second week. If they can. Malcolm asked what happened to those who didn't leave. The man hesitated. Then, softly. Only one stayed. A schoolmaster. Found him dead. In the chair. Still warm. Malcolm returned home in silence, and what he saw inside brought shivers to his spine. That he stood completely still and stoned. The portrait faced him again on the wall. The portrait had moved, in fact, traveled from the closet to the wall. That much he could no longer rationalize. He'd left it in the closet, angled sharply towards the wall. And now, it watched. He crossed the room, carefully, knelt by the baseboard, and examined the wall beneath it. No gaps. No signs of disturbance or intrusion. He touched the frame, cool, solid, unmoved. But something had touched it. Something had set it at its right place. He turned it back to the wall once more. He thought that maybe too much of quietness and solitude is taking a toll on his health, and maybe his mind is playing games with him. That he was a man of scientific temper and couldn't justify such superstitions. He then blew out the candle. And tried to sleep. That night, he was not alone. 2 events happened simultaneously. The wind outside picked up, but the walls held firm. For a moment, it felt peaceful. And then, the chain. A long metal chain, hanging from the ceiling in the hallway, began to swing. Not fast. Not violently. Just slightly, like someone brushing past. He stared. The air around it did not move. Yet the chain moved. He approached it, slowly. The metal links were cold. Still swinging. He held it steady. And from upstairs. A creak. Then another. Slow, deliberate footsteps above. And then the scratching returned. Not from above, not from behind the wall, but from inside the room. Subtle at first. A tiny shuffle across wood. Then again. And again. There, in the dim light of the hearth, something moved. Small. Quick. Too quiet for a person. Too purposeful for an animal. He lit the candle. The light revealed the tail end of a rat, disappearing behind a bookshelf. He exhaled, half in relief, half in curiosity. Rats, he murmured. Of course. Still, something felt odd. The house had been silent for days. Not a creak. Not a thump. Not a whisper. And now, rats? The next morning, he asked Mrs. Witham if the house had ever had infestations. She nearly dropped the tea kettle. Rats, she repeated. That house doesn't have rats, Mr. Malcolmson. Never has. Not in all the years it stood empty. He explained what he'd seen, briefly, not wanting to sound unsettled. But her face had grown pale, and she whispered. Some things come before others. It's how the judge returns. They say. When he does return. Malcolm frowned but stayed silent. Malcolm left Mrs. Witham's words behind at the breakfast table. But they didn't leave him. Some things come before others. These haunting words kept echoing in his mind. He repeated the phrase under his breath as he walked back through the wet lanes, the gray sky pressing low overhead. The town, once quaint, now felt watchful. Back at the judge's house, the gate groaned as if recognizing him. He entered. The absolute silence was waiting for him as usual. The rain began again, soft and ceaseless. It tapped against the tall windows like fingernails seeking entry. Malcolm had been reading the same paragraph for the past half hour. The words, once crisp and elegant, had turned to ash in his mind, crumbling as soon as he looked away. He closed the book, leaned back, and stared at the high ceiling above. Silence. Not a peaceful silence, a swollen, watching one, a silence which gives more discomfort than peace. Malcolm kept gazing at the empty wall where the portrait was hanging before. He felt that the presence of that portrait hasn't left him. The weight of the gaze that should not have returned. He kept glancing at the empty spot on the wall, certain he would see it again. First time in his life he felt something like premonition, a word which felt irrational and idiotic before, but now somewhere in his mind and heart he knew that he may see the portrait again. But that day he didn't, though the coming days will certainly justify his premonition. That night, he tried to sleep with the lights on. But the candle wouldn't stay lit and kept flickering. He lay still on the couch, eyes open, watching the ceiling. Then the sound returned. Then he heard it again. The scratching. Not distant. Not muffled behind a wall or ceiling. It was in the room. A long, delicate scrape. A pause. Then, a shuffle. He didn't move. He sat frozen, spine rigid, breath shallow. The sound came again, deliberate. A presence dragging across the floorboards. Slowly, he lowered his gaze to the far corner. There it was. The rat. Same one. Large, gray, with patches missing from its fur. Its eyes were black, too black, pools that reflected no flame. But it wasn't afraid. It wasn't sniffing or scampering or hiding. It was watching. A gaze which carried a strong judgment. Malcolm stood, slowly, and took a step forward. The rat didn't move. Another step. Still. He was now barely a foot away. It looked up at him. And for one brief, impossible second, he felt as if it knew him. Not just recognized, knew. As though it had always been here, with him or waiting for him, and now it was time. He reached for the fire poker. At that moment, the rat turned, not in panic, but with solemn purpose, and vanished under the tall bookshelf. Malcolm dropped to his knees and peered under. Nothing. No gap. No hole in the wall. Just polished wood and silence. The rat had vanished into the thin air. In the coming days, Malcolm descended into a kind of quiet madness, not the screaming kind, not the wild-eyed kind, but the reasonable kind. The dangerous kind. He stopped writing letters. He stopped going out for bread. He stopped changing clothes. When he slept, he dreamed of courtroom. When he woke, he half expected a gavel's bang. The rat returned every night, always with a more sterner, measuring and a judgmental gaze. In the final days, Malcolm stopped keeping time. There were no mornings anymore. Only dim hours and darker ones. He felt as though he has been trapped in some trance of the house which he couldn't leave behind. That day, at the final day of the judgment, the evening fell with a peculiar weight, as though the very dusk pressed against the windows, unwilling to be kept out. Malcolm set his books aside. His eyes were tired, not from study, but from strain, the kind born not of effort, but of watching shadows too long. He stood and paced the room, feeling restless and uneasy. The silence had grown denser in recent days. It no longer felt like peace. It felt heavy. As he turned, his eyes caught again on the far corner of the room, above the fireplace, the place where a bell rope descended from the ceiling. He had never paid much attention to it. That it was just today that he took the notice of it, and he felt very strange about it. At first glance, it had appeared simply a relic, a forgotten piece of some long-disused servant bell system, common in houses of a former age. The thick, twisted cord hung down in a single elegant drop, affixed to a brass loop in the wall just above a wooden bracket. The rest of the rope wound upward and vanished into the shadowed ceiling, to the small iron bell mounted in the chamber above, in what must once have been the servants' quarters. That it still remained connected and somehow alive seemed remarkable. He had not touched it. Yet now, standing beneath it, he found the rope strangely unsettling. Its position, directly above the place of the judge's portrait which he had locked in the closet, lent it a kind of grim authority. It was, he thought, the last living limb of the house. A tongue, perhaps, through which the house might speak. A bell rope, he murmured. A rat. And the portrait. I think, I'm letting local talk turn me superstitious. He would not admit fear. He folded his arms and laughed softly at himself. But his nerves had been touched. He felt the rope sway slightly above him. Once. Then still. He didn't pay much attention to the bell and turned his back to go to his study table, but a flow of cold air touched his neck which gave him shivers. Then, again, the scratching began. Soft. Purposeful. From the same corner. He did not look up at first. He knew what he would see. But after a time, unable to help himself, he raised his eyes. There it was, the rat. The same large creature. Gray-furred and alert, with eyes that glittered like jet. It sat unmoving, staring directly at him. Then, in one slow, deliberate movement, it climbed the bell rope. This time it did not pause halfway. It ascended to the very top, and perched where the rope coiled about the wooden support beam near the ceiling. Malcolm rose from his seat, holding a poker from the hearth, and approached. Still the rat did not move. It only watched. He hesitated. Then threw the poker upward. The creature darted along the beam and vanished in the shadows. But even as it disappeared, the rope swayed. Back and forth. Gently. Then more. And then, it pulled taut. The bell above rang. Once. Twice. A third time. Not loudly, but with a terrible clarity. The sound echoed through the empty halls. It was not a bell for summoning servants. It was a bell of warning. Of judgment. Malcolm stood transfixed. The rope still moved, though nothing visible touched it. This was too much for Malcolm and he began to run out of the hallway. In fact, he wanted to run out of the house, but as he turned he froze in his footsteps. The portrait was facing the room once again. He was certain, very certain, that he had locked it in the closet. The judge looked down at him. The face stern, the mouth tight. The finger, long and bony, pointed downward. Not at some imaginary figure, but towards him. As if passing a sentence. Malcolm fled the drawing room like a man running from his own soul. The hall was long, the gaslight low, and as he passed the first door, he stopped. The judge's portrait was there. Not in the drawing room, but hung above the stair. It had no right to be. And yet, there it was. And those eyes, they followed him. He took a step back. The gaze shifted. Only slightly. He turned and ran to the study. Slammed the door. But upon the wall, above the mantel, the portrait. Again. The same eyes. Gray. Icy. Watching. Judging. Impossible, he muttered, backing away. But as he moved, the painted pupils rolled gently, subtly, toward him. The candle flickered. He bolted into the upper corridor, breath ragged. In the guest chamber, the same face. Hung above the wash basin. Framed in black, unmoving but alive. The eyes turned again. And now, the mouth in the portrait was changing. Just slightly. It curled at the corner. A grim satisfaction. Malcolm's back struck the wall. And then, a sound. Not loud. Not fast. But deliberate. The rat. It emerged from beneath the dresser, that same gray creature, larger than it should be, with eyes black and wet. It stopped, looked at him, then turned. And from behind it, a shadow rose. At first it was just a shape. Tall. Robed. Then the outline of a wig. A narrow jaw. One hand, gloved, holding a small book. And then the face. It was not painted now. It was real. The judge. He stepped forward without sound. The rat did not move. Malcolm fell to his knees. "This is madness," he gasped. "You are not real." The judge said nothing. But his hand rose, one long finger extending outward, as in the portrait, not pointing to Malcolm now, but beckoning. "Come," the gesture said. Malcolm backed away, into the main stairwell. The bell rope above had begun to sway. Softly. Then harder. The bell rang once. Then again. Then a third time. Malcolm turned to flee. The judge's portrait was there again, right above the staircase landing. The eyes locked on his. The mouth now open, just enough to suggest a word unsaid. He turned back. The judge was closer. The rat had vanished. Malcolm stumbled back toward the drawing room. The rope hung unusually low now, swaying beside him. He looked up at it. The judge's house had a servant's bell system, long and used. And now, it was moving. Tugged by invisible hands. Malcolm seized a chair. He climbed it, determined to sever the rope, to silence the noise, to prove something still obeyed reason and logic. The candle beside him flickered once, then went out. Darkness bloomed in the corners of the room. And then there was a voice, the judge's voice, quiet, without breath, yet it filled the room like an ancient toll. "You knew the law, Dot. The sentence is death." Malcolm could not move. His hand dropped the knife. His knees faltered. The rope finally stilled. A soft thud echoed through the chamber. And everything in the room went still, like a breath leaving the body followed by a deadly silence. The judgment was finally served. The next morning came, gray and uncertain. Mrs. Witham, uneasy with the lack of messages and any communication from Malcolm, had gathered help and reached the house. The front door was unlocked. The rooms were empty. But in the drawing room, they found him. Malcolm Malcolmson. Dead. Sprawled on the floor. His face bore a look of frozen horror. And around his throat, a deep, livid mark where the bell rope had curled. The doctor said little. No injury. No sign of attack. But the fire had long gone out. Above the fireplace, the portrait still hung. The judge's mouth, once tight, now showed the faintest shadow of a smile. A smile of satisfaction. They buried Malcolm quietly. No questions were asked, because everybody knew why. Only the silence remained. The kind that follows a gavel's final strike.